Tēnā koutou katoa and hello everybody. Welcome to the Lentil Intervention Podcast. My name is Ben Adelberg and I'm coming to you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. Tēnei ka mihi ke te mana whenua o Aotearoa. And we acknowledge the local tribal authorities of New Zealand.
And g'day, I'm Emma Strutt and I'm currently coming to you from Dalrymple country in Queensland. Before we dive into our conversation today, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. And finally, if you enjoyed this potty, please like, comment, share, subscribe on our social media and consider buying us a coffee to help support our work. Now with the show.
Just a few episodes ago, we had a chat with Dr. Emily Flies about the health benefits of engaging with a biodiverse natural environment, including our mental and physical well-being. In this episode, I hope to take this conversation a little deeper and explore how this could be implemented within our urban settings.
That's right. So today we're really thrilled to be chatting with Professor Sarah Bekessy from RMIT University. Sarah is an ARC Future Fellow teaching in Sustainability and Urban Planning at RMIT since 2004. She's an absolute expert on biodiversity sensitive urban design, threatened species management, as well as so much more. Honestly, Sarah is involved in such a wide range of research and consulting programs. If I listed them all out, the info would be the whole episode. But we definitely need to mention that Sarah is a lead counsellor of the Biodiversity Council, a board member of Bush Heritage Australia, and leads the ICON Science Research Group. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on this excellent podcast.
Thank you. And we just have to say that a big thank you to your teenage daughter for giving us high praise for the podcast as well. It's put us on a buzz.
Look,
and
I run everything I do past her and she said, definitely do this one, Mum. They're excellent.
There we go, listeners. Please share and subscribe this episode. Sarah, let's start off with a little bit about yourself. As Emma mentioned, so much we could talk about, but tell us a little bit about what got you into this whole field of the environment, biodiversity, and not just that, but then this whole urban planning and you know, and bring it all together. How did that all start?
Sure. Oh, gosh. Well, I don't know. It depends how far back you want to go. But I mean, I actually think, I have reflected on this a bit. I actually think that my childhood had a really important, as probably for most environmentally conscious people, childhoods are so important in shaping your kind of values and your, the things you care about. But I grew up in Brisbane, actually, Emma, not where you are, but in Brisbane. And
You go country.
yeah, that's right. And I actually was on a quarter-acre block in Ashgrove. And, when we moved into that house when I was 2 years old, we had extraordinary biodiversity. So my whole childhood I grew up and there were crowned snakes and jumping mice and goannas, frilled-necked lizards, obviously all the possums, but just extraordinary biodiversity. And I was so lucky when I look back on it to have that experience. But to be honest, as time went by, people put fences up. People in Brisbane will know this time when it happened. They put fences up. They got dogs or cats. They cut down all the big kind of dangerous trees. I haven't even talked about the birds we had. We used to have so many extraordinary birds that would visit our backyard. And I just noticed over time how much stuff disappeared. And it really sort of made a huge impact on my sort of outlook, I suppose. And I think for my whole life, I've just wondered, how can we coexist with nature in cities, in a better kind of way, in a way that actually nurtures, doesn't damage. No, I don't think urban environments have to be hostile to nature. They don't have to be dangerous places to nature. They can actually be places where nature can thrive. And, talking about your previous guest, if we can manage that, then we're all going to thrive. And our own health and well-being and future, I think, depends on that, us achieving that balance.
Your story's just reminded of my own childhood of how many times we had poisonous snakes running through our house, monkeys stealing food off the windowsill as was cooling down after being cooked, and my dad always keeping an eye on fruit outside, and he knew it was ripe because the birds were going at it. So you're right, a very biodiverse upbringing. And now I think, okay, I'm in a different country, but it's so sterile. There's
Yeah,
we've just heard some sirens in the background. Those weren't birds; those were
I
cars
know.
going past. But it really has changed, and
Yeah.
that certainly will have an impact on our well-being in general.
It does, even if we don't notice it. There's a thing called shifting baselines where, you look out your window and you think it's always been like that. Even if, 5 years ago, there actually used to be kookaburras, but they've gone, you kind of adjust your frame pretty quickly. Humans are quite good at this. And so you don't feel the distress of that loss necessarily. We actually gave a talk to a land care organisation, my partner recently in Mitamita in the far northeast of Victoria, and he was talking about how the website for the town described it being a place where you could just about trip over bandicoots and potoroos in the street because there used to be so many of them, and people used to complain about having their gardens dug up by bandicoots, and they were annoyance. But people in the audience were like, God, where are the bandicoots? Where are the potoroos? They've actually disappeared from this landscape. And it wasn't until Brendan kind of gave that talk that they realised that they'd gone. So yeah, I don't know. I think there's a sort of weird thing where you see the beauty, probably in preference to kind of understanding the loss. And in Australia, over the last sort of couple of decades, it's not just the species that have disappeared, but it's also the abundance of animals and plants have actually really declined. There's been some very kind of convincing monitoring of this, and plants, like sort of 3/4 of the abundance has gone for a lot of our threatened plants. Birds, about 50% of the abundance has gone. So it's not just that there are less species, it's just that there are less of them. So we have less of that benefit. We know that birdsong, for example, I'm sure your previous guest talked about this, is really critical to our well-being. If you can hear a beautiful bird chorus in the morning, it's not just waking up feeling good, it's actually doing really substantially excellent things to your own sort of, health and well-being.
And I mean, not just in Australia, but globally, we're becoming more urbanised. And, as our cities continue to grow, there's been a lot of talk about greening our cities in our urban landscapes, and that's a fantastic start. But there does need to be some deeper consideration. So I'd really love to talk about your work funded by the Ian Potter Foundation.
Yeah.
Something you're really passionate about is making sure that these new green spaces are actually sensitive to fostering biodiversity. And, it's no secret that Australia has a biodiversity crisis. And there are a number of threatened species that live in and around our urban areas. So how do we actually design our cities to both allow people and nature genuinely flourish in these spaces, not just plant a whole bunch of trees that aren't native?
Yeah, well, great question. Yeah, and you're spot on in that, the enthusiasm for urban greening is quite phenomenal around the world, and in part it's because I think it really hit home in Melbourne in 2009 when we had those terrible bushfires all around Melbourne, and people died in those fires. But what is not commonly known is that way more people, more than double the impact of people, died from heat waves in Melbourne in that same time. And it really shone the light on the need for planners to make our cities habitable and livable in the face of extreme weather events. And so, I think canopy cover in a streetscape, as we know, can really dramatically reduce the temperature. You know it yourself. If you walk down a street with lots of trees in the middle of the summer, it's kind of, a great relief, because it can be 20 degrees cooler than being stuck out on on the bitumen, for example, sometimes more. And the City of Melbourne, for example, thinks that they are achieving really substantial cooling effects by having this kind of urban forest strategy. Problem is, you can fill a city with trees and have very little benefit to biodiversity. I'm sitting here in North Fitzroy looking out at a plane tree, they're planted all around Melbourne, and very little biodiversity. Even insects use plane trees. It's kind of they're a bit of a biodiversity desert. So our passion is thinking about opportunities everywhere to enhance the biodiversity of our urban greening, as well as just making it sort of cooler for people. So how do we put in structural diversity? You know, it really frustrates me that when we put vegetation in streets, all we do is put a canopy in. If we put a little bit of mid-story and a bit of understory as well, then suddenly the biodiversity you can support skyrockets. If you think about diversity of species, you know, sometimes you look down a street and it's exactly the same tree planted, you know, every few meters. And you think, well, that means that if that tree flowers at one time of the year, then there's nothing else for the biodiversity for the rest of the year. So what about we plant diversity of species and even think quite carefully about trying to provide resources throughout the year? And, you know, see every sort of urban entity as an opportunity for biodiversity. We can use our rooftops, we know we can use walls, we can use roundabouts. I'm really passionate about schoolyards. There's such an underutilised space for biodiversity in our cities. You know, obviously our streetscapes, front yards and backyards, they're hugely important places where we can all be doing our bit for biodiversity through wildlife gardening, it's called. You know, really thinking carefully about what do you want to attract into your garden, and putting the resources, the things that we say we have to do are think about the resources that species need. So it might be water, it might be logs or rocks, it might be plants and flowers. Think about the threats that your urban environment might pose to them and try and minimise them. So things like roads and how we, you know, reduce speeds and or windows. You know, there's bird-friendly glass. We could all be having bird-friendly glass in every single one of our windows and never have another bird die from striking a window. And then thinking about connectivity. So you can't, unfortunately, be your own little kind of oasis in the city. You depend on your neighbours and your council and the city as a whole to do the right thing to connect it up so that animals and plants can actually thrive and move and be able to recolonise places and come back to places. So yeah, that's the kind of perspective that we take when we're trying to encourage cities to be places that both people and nature can thrive.
But how do you encourage the shift for, say, a council? Because the council has put thought into it. They've put thought into something that's going to be low to minimal maintenance. You know, doesn't need to be trimmed, doesn't need less risk of it falling in a hurricane or a climatic event. You know, really simple. That's why it is always the same tree, and it's a particular tree. Mm-hmm. Under canopy, oh no, that's too much maintenance, and you know, that's going to affect parking and health and safety because someone's going to trip, and it has been thought through. So it needs to be a shift. Are there examples of cities that do it well? I mean, for me to mind straight away, I don't know why Barcelona pops up. Cities in Denmark or Sweden pop up. But are there examples of high urban areas that do it well?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. And if I have to be honest, we spend, you know, half of our time working in this, we call it biodiversity sensitive urban design, and we get a lot of interest from, I mean, one of the great things that sort of drives all of this is that people want it. People, time and time again, when surveyed, want to have beautiful biodiversity, enchanting biodiversity in their lives. Who doesn't? And they're actually starting to demand it of their councils. So councils are like, oh, okay, how do we do this? And you are completely right that a lot of the design of cities is based around low maintenance, kind of low risk. And so a lot of our time is spent trying to find design solutions for the kinds of problems you're talking about. You know, dropping. You don't want people to be killed by dropping limbs. You don't want people to be tripping on roots. You don't want people to be, you know, at risk of additional risk of fire, for example. And so there are design solutions for all that. We haven't actually come across something we can't find a design solution for and still provide for biodiversity. It might be, you know, not the perfect biodiversity solution, but it's still going to be a solution that sort of fits the needs of people and nature. So it's completely doable. Let me just tell you that. But the other thing is we need to start investing in our biodiverse streetscapes, in our green infrastructure, they call it. exactly the same way that we invest in other infrastructure. It can't just be a set and forget sort of type thing. We actually need to care for it, nurture it, make it thrive, because the benefits are enormous. Our people are going to be healthier. Our, our streets are going to be cooler. They're going to be more resilient to extreme weather events. We're going to be able to clean water before it goes into our waterways, and so therefore have less interventions when it comes to our own kind of need for water. And as I said, the health and well-being benefits alone are a kind of a justifiable public health kind of intervention. Quite cheap, actually, when you look at the benefits. And so if we start investing in it, not just as a kind of as a sort of like an added benefit, but as something as we genuinely think needs to be in our cities as a kind of core aspect of our infrastructure, then that also shifts the thinking.
And I know some urban design approaches almost consider the issue of biodiversity as a constraint rather than an opportunity. And the idea of offsets get thrown around a lot. And on the show before, we've dissected the use of offsets, usually in the context of carbon emissions. There's been a couple of ecological circumstances that we've talked about. Each situation typically results in the same conclusion, that it's fundamentally flawed. But what about in this case when we're trying to address biodiversity concerns in urban areas?
Yeah, you're absolutely right that, one of the big problems is our planning system as a whole still thinks of biodiversity and treats biodiversity as a constraint and a problem. You actually have a constraint layer that's an overlay in the planning system. And, they haven't shifted to seeing biodiversity as the awesome asset that it is. What we should be doing in our planning system is seeing biodiversity as a massive asset and trying to enhance it at every step of the planning process instead of seeing it as a constraint. And the problem with offsetting is that all of those benefits I've just been describing, our kids have got better cognitive development if they play in a playground with biodiversity. You will sleep better and have, better sort of cardiac health and, lower chance of cancer if you live in a street with biodiversity. Like, they're really compelling, remarkable benefits. If you think of biodiversity as something to be offset, it inevitably ends up being, if it is recreated or if it's as protected, there's this thing called averted loss offsets where you can, it's okay to clear vegetation in a city as long as you put a fence around a bit of vegetation outside of the city. Now, that's not really a gain in anyone's books. That's losing half of everything. But even under that circumstance, you're not going to be providing those benefits to the people who can every day experience those enhancements to their lives. And so it's a failed approach in terms of the social aspect. There's also kind of really sort of strong ecological arguments why offsetting is a bit of a furphy. I mean, no two trees are the same, let alone two patches of habitat. And I think the other thing that it doesn't capture is the place-based value. Ben and I were talking about our childhoods and the places where we love nature. Well, you couldn't just kind of recreate that like somewhere else. They're the places. The places are really important. And, when it comes to cultural significance, the most ridiculous example of an offset in Victoria was when they're still planning to expand or duplicate the Western Highway. And there were these trees that were 1,000-year-old birthing trees that were sacred trees. And, how can you tell these people who their children have been birthed in these trees for 1,000 years that you can offset them? I mean, I think to me that is just the ultimate example of how ridiculous offsetting is as a concept.
In one of the many articles that you've written, you also talk about there's a high rate or high risk, not sure, of threatened species within an urban setting. So, and you've just touched on that with the trees, but how, because we're talking about health benefits, so we can push all about the benefits for humans, for us humans, but we are usually the cause of the problems. What about the actual biodiversity itself? It's even more critical within an urban area. So, when we talk about the offsetting and, we can do something somewhere else, but within that urban area, if we lose that, we lose that, right? There's certain elements that if we don't care for it right now, it's lost.
Yeah, you're 100% correct. So I think it's a poorly understood fact that cities are actually in Australia, New Zealand, but many, many other parts of the world can be real hotspots for biodiversity, for threatened species. And, we could probably have a whole podcast on why that is, because I think it's fascinating. But, my take on it is that essentially, we've built cities where they're fertile, they're flat, usually flattish, at least where they're wet, they're
Wetlands.
rich.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. They're usually cities have got multiple ecosystems because people wanted to have both oceans and agricultural land and all the kind of resources. And so we've systematically targeted those kinds of places for our cities. And a lot of the ecosystems that are the most critically endangered on the edge of our cities have been like things like grasslands, for example, around Melbourne. Brisbane has, I think, about 97% of the vegetation of the Greater Brisbane is threatened. So
Brisbane's shocking.
Because a massive river flowing through it, it would be hugely fertile around it, wouldn't it?
But it's such a sprawling city, and
absolutely.
Every time you go to the fringes, it's just anyway.
No, tell me about it. So the reality is, if we are actually keen on having, I think both of our countries have committed to no new extinctions, and then we have to actually get serious about cities as places for investment, for conservation as well. I mean, there are some of the most critically endangered ecosystems in Australia are on the edges of Melbourne, Sydney, Perth, and Brisbane. So, and Canberra, actually. Grasslands, Cumberland Plains in woodlands in Sydney. In Brisbane, you've got that Toondah Harbour development that's been proposed in Moreton Bay. Extraordinary, like a Ramsar wetland, and they're going to on the edges of Perth, you've got this extraordinary Banksia woodland. It's actually a world biodiversity hotspot, this Banksia woodland, with amazing species, and so much of it, hundreds of thousands of hectares, have been cleared for housing just in very recent years. It's a very current threat. It's not something that we've been able to put a cap on yet. And the call for more housing is sort of really making governments kind of push to open up new areas for housing. That's a whole new sort of conversation that we could have. How do we grow our cities and not impact on biodiversity? I've got lots of ideas about that.
So what should we be looking at then? Because, for example, I'll use Brisbane. Each time you drive the fringes, there's been bushland knocked down, and you've got all of these houses that are so close together, their roofs are basically touching. There'll be token park here and there, maybe some non-native trees. But that's one option. The other option is, the high rises where you're completely detached from the streetscape and your green spaces. What is the best way forward? Is it medium density? Is it what are we talking about here as a solution?
Yeah, well, I mean, so, we did a bit of research actually that was looking at Melbourne as an example, and showed that there is enough kind of sort of abandoned industrial land, like brownfield sites they call them, within the city, that you could really sort of, with medium density housing, you could really meet Melbourne's housing needs, for the foreseeable future. So, what we don't do well in this country, you're right, we have high-rises, and they're very low-quality high-rise on the whole, so people have to live in, noisy, very little light. They're very poorly designed, and I don't think they're any of the way that we should be living as, in Australia or anywhere. But then you've got the urban fringe, monstrosities that sort of go forever and ever and ever. And they're just some of the lowest density, most land consuming kind of types of development that you could ever possibly imagine. And what we don't have is what we call it sustainable mid-rise. The idea, you talked about Barcelona before, Ben, and, that European cities have kind of worked it out, that you can have really high density cities fit all the people you need into a city. But also have livable environments where you can still there's a kind of planning idea that if you can look out the window and yell at your kids and see a tree, then it's you're still connected to streetscape. So that kind of limits your thinking to four to six stories, which is what you see a lot in Berlin and Barcelona and a lot of the European cities. And you might even have a shared kind of central courtyard that you can have biodiverse, rich spaces for kids to play. We actually lived in Leipzig for a little bit when I was on maternity leave, and it was a fabulous way to live. At the end of the day, parents would all come down with their kids and a glass, gin and tonic or something, and it was community oriented, but there was biodiversity with high density, but really well designed. We don't have many examples of that in Australian cities, or New Zealand cities actually, for that matter. But we really do need to be thinking, I think, more along those lines if we want to have livable cities where people can connect with nature, but are also dense enough so that we're not sort of sprawling into some of our most critically endangered habitat.
Yeah, New Zealand's very well known for a very sprawled way of living. Certainly high density, not at all, but that causes other issues. We can't make public transport as one of the examples work because we don't have the high density. And yeah, it's very difficult to find a right answer because there are a lot of environmental benefits of having high density living because you don't need more land. You just go up. You make public transport work, so less vehicles on the road, but there's also it's that balance. How important are within urban settings? Now, this is difficult once you already have that urban setting set, but in the earlier days, having allocated, there's different names, green belts, town belts, that's just pieces of land that's going to stay green. I will refer to an example, though, Wellington, New Zealand's capital. They had, I think it was in 1840s or so. I did some research when I last ran there a few weekends ago. Hundreds of hectares of land allocated as a town belt and so on. But now only 2/3 of it remains. So even though it was allocated, 2/3, but it was repurposed, and this is the logic, for public purposes, but hospitals and all sorts. So still, you've put concrete instead of green. How important are those town belts, green belts, urban belts, whatever we want to call them? How much do they actually, because you're connecting, aren't you? You're connecting all the...
Yeah. So, I've talked a lot about streetscapes and kind of really highly urbanised places where we probably don't think much about nature, and they've got real potential to enhance the nature of a city overall. But they also will depend on having sort of large tracts of nature. So usually they're kind of by the sides of our rivers or oceans, or large parks that it can be, ideally places where you can still have remnant vegetation. And, there have been some visionary planners in the past in New Zealand and Australia who have set aside places and said, look, Melbourne, for example, has a sort of urban growth boundary. We don't want to, and green wedges, they're called, places where we're not meant to develop. And the reason why, it's not actually just biodiversity as well. Sometimes it's food. A lot of, as I talked about before, cities are places that are rich, flat, fertile. It's, the Melbourne catchment is the second most productive catchment in terms of food production in our state, even though most of it is housing. But it's still producing the second most second biggest quantity of food for Melbourne. So, there's also that trade-off that you have to consider. We do need to stick to our guns and actually say, well, these were put in place for a reason, and there may be a really good public reason to sort of think about other uses for that site. But our study of Melbourne showed that there's so much land that we can develop without touching our precious green wedges and green spaces. And the second we start actually valuing them for what they're worth, we'll hopefully, and I think people are starting to more and more appreciate, especially after COVID, when people relied on those places for their sanity, quite literally.
Yeah. But didn't COVID also really shine a light on access to these places within cities? It's not always equitable, is it?
No, you are correct. And it's one of the great shames, I think, of urban planning that, so much of our city where you see beautiful examples of thriving vegetation and biodiversity is where the rich people are. And it's actually poorer parts of the city that usually have the least access to nature. So that's something that has to be looked at really seriously. It's an environmental justice issue. It's a social justice issue that people, our children, why should rich people's children have improved cognitive development because they've got nature if not all the society can have that? It's a genuine justice issue, I think.
And speaking of which, you mentioned sense of place before. Something that's really important in Australia is Indigenous-led conservation, working on country, keeping traditional knowledge, culture alive. And, you know, there's thousands of years of experience to draw on in regards to native flora and fauna and weather and season patterns. Kinship to country is so important, and their knowledge just can't be surpassed. But in urban environments where so much of the natural habitat has already been lost, it's easy to forget, but it's still country. So how important are Indigenous-led biodiversity projects within cities?
Oh my gosh, so important. You know, I think it's being gradually realised that urban caring for country is as legitimate as any caring for country. You know, and there are more First Nations Australians living in cities than there are in rural places, just as there are more people, you know, of all cultural derivations living in cities as rural counterparts. So providing opportunities for First Nations people to be part of the governance and implementation and planning and management of urban nature is a huge opportunity. You know, every city should have an urban caring for country plan. Every city should have an urban ranger program. You know, and our playgrounds should celebrate culture, and the plants and animals that we choose to try and bring back to our cities should be culturally significant species that tell a story. There's a great species that Melbourne's trying to bring back called the common brown butterfly, which is a very terrible, boring name. But this butterfly once used to emerge at the start of one of the 7 Wurundjeri seasons in huge numbers, and it was an event, you know, that would signify the start of that season. And we've lost that in Melbourne, but what a great cultural story if we could bring it back through each of our efforts that we could make by planting plants that could be a resource for that butterfly. That would be a wonderful day if we could bring back that event. So yeah, I think they talk about nature as being nature for nature. So we've talked about nature for conserving nature for society, so having clean air and clean water and cool streets, and then nature for culture, which is linking our sense of place, our belonging, our history, our rich, you know, First Nations culture. And all of these things can be brought to bear through having urban nature.
Yeah, and I mean, even for me, like I know when I've been on a long overseas stint and you get out of the airport and you see the sights and you smell the gum trees and the wattles, you really do get such a feeling of home, and like it's comforting to be where you belong. So like if we start losing that biodiversity, you lose a sense of self along the way, really.
You truly do. I completely agree with you.
We need to talk a little bit about some of the entities that you're involved in because they're hugely important. You're very passionate about them as well. And we seem to have done things a little bit differently, but I love this. This is good conversation. But let's a few steps back. There's so many entities we could talk about, but Biodiversity Council.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a passion project of many people working in the biodiversity space in Australia. You know, we know that most Australians care about nature, and every survey that's ever done shows that it's upward of 90, 95%, 97% was the latest one that I read, of Australians care deeply about nature. Of course we do. You know, it's part of our national identity. You were sort of talking about it before, Emma. And and yet, you know, we consistently sort of like vote in ways that sort of would not reflect that. We don't prioritise biodiversity in budgets, for example. We continue to just let kind of pretty disastrous things happen all around us. And one of the reasons why is that, you know, the other thing that happens in surveys is that it shows that people also think that biodiversity is going okay. It's a bit like that shifting baselines I was telling you about before. You know, people look out their window and don't remember the things that have disappeared. And they probably have a vision of, you know, outback Australia or outback New Zealand doing pretty hunky-dory out there. Things are kind of going okay. And they're really not. They're really, really not. And so we wanted to put together a kind of science-based organisation that could communicate, really rigorous science and information in a way that is going to try and help the Australian population learn to prioritise something that we all do value but don't appreciate is actually, going down the toilet.
And I see it's quite a collaborative approach as well. It's great to see Professor Greta Petzel on there. She's a past guest of ours.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I'm trying to see. Oh, maybe we can get a few more in here. But what is important is the collaborative approach, because it means you're not looking at it in isolation. You're looking at it for the benefit of the community of Australia. But interestingly, what about industry?
Yeah, so we don't have industry explicitly represented on the council as a science-based organisation. We do have, our aim is, and we're pretty close to it, to have a third of our councils being First Nations Australians. That's a very big part of the organisation, is to ensure that healing country, caring for country, and First Nations perspectives on nature first front and really at the front of kind of everything that we do and advocate for as an organisation. But we intend to, and we do already, work very deeply and meaningfully with industry to sort of, and often we can be allies in making demands to government for various kind of good biodiversity outcomes. So it's definitely part of the modus operandi. Even if they're not councillors, they're going to be definitely deep and meaningful partners.
And just leading sort of sideways from industry, what about schemes like Green Building Council?
Yeah.
Surely there's an opportunity there. Schemes like that, we've sort of spoken about it in the past a little bit, and I've got experience working with those kind of entities. And the problem I have with them, there's a lot of merit, but the problem I have with them is it's a when doing these scores, ratings, it's all about a cumulative approach. It's just which boxes can you tick? Can you get to a threshold? Yay, you're amazing. Here's 5 stars. But should something like this not be compulsory? Should we not be moving towards, when we're rating a building or a new build or a design, saying, okay, here's some optionals, but you will not get a rating unless you meet the compulsories. And compulsory, something like including biodiversity, enhancing biodiversity in your build or in your design, because it's critical. It's no longer an option. It is critical. So why not encourage those kind of entities to do the same?
Oh my gosh, I completely agree with you. I think it's a really important shift that we need to see. And in fact, I've got a fantastic PhD student, Beth Lee, working on exactly this thing. She's doing a survey of all of the kind of green building type codes around the world to look at how they're tackling biodiversity. And, she's finding that it's pretty loose on the whole, and a lot about what you're promising to do, not what you actually deliver, which is also problematic. And then, the kind of core of it, which I think is about, being really sensitive to place, having really strong objectives. So what are you trying to achieve for biodiversity? And then, even monitoring what you have achieved post occupancy or post build. They're kind of largely missing. So I completely agree with you that the regulators and the certifiers, it's not just building, it's also kind of, meat and livestock organisations, farming organisations. We need to get a lot of those organisations on board with having really sort of reliable, defensible, strong kind of certifications and the like, so that people can be confident that what they're buying is something that's not going to be damaging biodiversity, and ideally is something that's kind of regenerative for biodiversity.
And in the interim, because obviously that will take time to change, land protection organisations like Bush Heritage Australia, you're a board member of that, I believe. We've had Chris Darwin on the show before, who's been very involved, such a legend. But please tell us all about it.
Oh, Bush Heritage Australia. It's such a beautiful organisation. Yeah, I'm on the board. I have obviously pretty strong interest in what they do, but I'm really proud of what they do. They probably don't blow their own trumpet very much, But they're out there buying land that would otherwise be kind of developed inappropriately, and we'd lose the biodiversity. And really special places, large areas, and really significant areas, and then not just buying them and locking them up. No, buying them and bringing health back to country. And when I say that, I mean it really working in partnership. Almost all of our properties are managed. We hope to have all of them managed in partnership with traditional owners, with First Nations custodians, and making sure that we are, appropriately managing and bringing health back to country, and also creating opportunities for traditional owners to sort of draw income from land. And so there's a social side to what Bush Heritage does that probably a lot of people also don't know about. It's a really extraordinary organisation in the sort of in terms of the emphasis that it places on doing right way science, and doing right way management, and doing it in a really inclusive and kind of and prioritising outcomes for First Nations Australians. So I mean, and some of the places that Bush Heritage manage and operate are just places that are breathtaking, extraordinary environments, and people can visit them. They can volunteer. We love to have people volunteering, and you can visit these extraordinary places and see them for yourself.
What's scary, though, is that an organisation like yourself has to step in to save these special places. That's what's really scary about, and it goes back to the earlier conversation we've had about policy change, influencing change. It's 2023. Why are we still, looking at, as you say, special places like this? Why are we considering anything else but preserving, conserving, and enhancing? Because that's really what we should be doing with the little that we have left.
I couldn't agree more. Obviously, in an ideal world, an organisation like Bush Heritage Australia wouldn't have to exist. We wouldn't have to be sort of like, trying to scrape around doing the right thing because no one else is. And we desperately need more investment, both in New Zealand and Australia, for threatened species, for wild places, for, caring for country. And it's just, you see budget after budget, in good times or bad, it doesn't seem to get the kind of investment that it needs ever. So that's one of the key things that the Biodiversity Council wants to do, is to try and sort of coordinate with others to sort of put forward evidence-based demands about budgets. What's it going to take to really, truly have no further extinctions in this country? What do we need to do, and how much is it going to cost? And let's put the money on the table, and then we can help you work out how to prioritise it and spend it. But it's just currently missing. Like, we just had a Victorian budget in, that there was one standout, of course, which was funding to see the sort of end to native forest harvesting in our state, which is like a very big win. But, what you didn't hear was that funding for a lot of the other biodiversity programs has been slashed, cut, big programs shut down, very little funding that is going into biodiversity otherwise. And, we can't maintain that for any... It's actually, you talked about a crisis, Emma, it is a crisis. We need governments to start stepping up and doing the right thing by biodiversity in both of our countries.
Well, it's not a political tool, and it's... unfortunately wrongly influenced by the very industry that I was referring to earlier, getting their buy-in. Unfortunately, it's going the wrong way. Now, we always believe as individuals, listening to this conversation, it's gosh, this is this Big Brother stuff. This is not for me. What can I do? As individuals, we can always take action. We can always do our small part. And this one will take a little bit of time. So let's get into it now. But you have contributed to an article very recently in the conversation. I was going to say the conservation, but maybe it should be the conservation. The conversation. Yeah. But some steps we can do, some steps we can take to make a positive impact on the biodiversity in our urban areas. Do you want us talk us through it, and
Yeah,
we can,
sure.
we'll have a little deliberation around them as well. But
Sure, absolutely. Look, it's controversial probably in some ways, but what motivated this, if I have to go back to a personal anecdote, was that the Threatened Species Commissioner of Australia, the newly appointed one from several years ago, came to visit our research group just to hear about what we were doing and so forth. And it was a really great conversation. And one of the things she said was, look, people ask me every day, what can they do for biodiversity? We probably all know what we can do for climate. We can turn our lights off, we can drive less, we can take fewer plane trips. We probably have some idea of a lot of the consumption choices we can make around that are climate friendly. But, in the same way, everything we do in our lives can impact on biodiversity. Every product that we buy, every sort of service that we invest in or fund or what have you is going to have an impact on biodiversity. So what we wanted to do was really look at how we could come up with a set of behaviours that we would say are priority behaviours, things that we can all do on an everyday basis that are going to have a high positive impact on biodiversity. Do you want me to kind of...
Let's get straight into it. Yeah. Step number one.
Okay. Well, look, it's a mix of things. And to be fair, these are all things that have... We had a kind of table a figure where we had impact on one axis. So how much positive biodiversity impact could you have by changing that behaviour? And then feasibility on the other axis. So how likely is it that you're ever going to achieve this? Getting everyone to run for parliament is, high impact, but probably not very feasible. So what are the things that everyone could probably do tomorrow, actually, relatively easily? That's what we were really seeking in this particular article. There are lots of other behaviours that might be slightly more high impact, but harder to change, of course. But these are all things that we thought, that the experts thought in our study were high impact and feasible. So things like...
It's the kind of thing you can finish listening to this episode and straight away
go
and do.
100%.
That's what we want.
That's right.
Yeah.
So what you eat is really important. That's kind of probably directly understandable.
And we go on a lot about this.
Yes, I know you do. That's interesting. So, one of the top ones is eating less red meat. So beef and lamb in both of our countries are, hugely impactful on biodiversity. And that's in terms of the, trampling of watercourses, deforestation. There's a lot of deforestation that happens to support beef and lamb production. When they're finished with kind of grains and so forth. So it's a really high impact industry. So we're just saying eat a bit less red meat, not so necessarily arguing for a completely meat-free existence, but, what if we all did meat-free Monday? That just is one day. Let's start with that. But, that's one big thing that you can do. Another one, of course, is fish. So we know that there are a lot of fisheries around the world that are really struggling in terms of their sustainability. And, that means that species are, threatened and some of them are kind of like, almost inevitably going to go extinct unless we change the way that we do with that industry is managed. And the way that you can very directly influence the way that the fisheries is managed is go to your fish shop and ask for sustainable products. And you can look at certification schemes, look at them with a critical eye potentially, but look at them, see what they recommend. And they're going to recommend some things that are obviously going to be more sustainable than others. So make informed choices when you go to the fish shop and ask them, what are they doing for sustainability? What are the products they're choosing that are going to be sustainable? Other things are about your pets. So, we all love our cats and dogs, but they can actually be quite high impact on biodiversity. So dogs, for example, when you're walking them in natural areas, they might love getting off lead and sort of chasing a bunch of birds around or, chasing a kind of possum up a tree or what have you, and you might think it's cute, and it kind of probably is in a way, but every time that happens, that animal is less able to do the other things it needs to do in its fragile existence to persist. And sometimes, like on beaches, for example, there are birds that have flown from Siberia, literally, to be on that beach. They need to eat. They seriously need to eat and eat and eat and eat. And if they don't get that chance to put on fat, then they're going to not be able to fly to the next step on their migratory journey. So if your dog goes in there and rustles them all up and has a great little time doing that, it's actually going to mean those birds are less likely to be able to migrate to the next destination. So seeing it like that, why not just put them on a lead? And not that in natural settings, that's something that's very easy to do. But the dogs will still have fun, I can guarantee it, but they'll be on a lead and won't be able to disturb animals in their natural habitats. Cats also are something that we don't perhaps understand quite how damaging they can be in a natural environment. I didn't talk
In New
about
Zealand, we
this.
do.
Okay, good.
Unfortunately.
That's excellent.
Yeah.
I'm glad. And I mean, I think that you guys have got pretty sort of good council laws about keeping cats indoors. No?
No, we understand the issue, but do we do anything about it? No, it's there's a lot of push, but no, I mean, I can tell you now, I've got three different cats from neighbors that come strolling past my window. I mean,
Yeah.
they do roam. There are no strict laws or bylaws or anything to safeguard it, but it is a problem. There have been some colourful characters in New Zealand that have been well known to
Yeah.
speak out and say we should kill all cats in New Zealand and should get rid of them. They are a problem for our native birds. It's again going back to our native birds because a lot of them, didn't have predators, so they don't fly, or they're more susceptible to being caught by cats and so on. So cats more of an issue than dogs here in New Zealand for sure.
So it's the same. Well, I mean, cats are definitely a big part of the problem in Australia as well. And I think even in urban areas, people perhaps don't understand that their cats go out, and the amount of wildlife that they're killing on an annual basis is massive and really, really problematic. So there have been lots of good campaigns by zoos and the like to encourage people to keep their cats indoors. And the other advantage to that is that your cat is safer and healthier. And in terms of urban design, we've been, trying to kind of come up with these catio designs. They're called catios, where your cat can have a patio. So it can be kept sort of in a safe environment where they're not exposed to cat flu and the like, but they're also getting the sunshine and they're not eating native birds. So I think that's kind of getting a fair bit of airtime in Australia, and a lot of councils are now seriously considering. A lot of them have brought in rules around keeping your cats indoors, which I think is a really good move.
And a quick plug for Biodiversity Council's fact sheet there on the impact of roaming pet cats on Australian wildlife, because it is atrocious. So everyone go download that. We'll link it in the show notes.
Thank you. I should have done that, Emma. That's brilliant. The other kinds of things relate to, one of them I think perhaps people don't think about much is how they invest their money. So you may think, I don't have any money, what are you talking about? But, probably everyone's got a superannuation account. Where's your superannuation going? And is it sort of to biodiversity positive businesses, or is it to banks and mining corporations that are definitely shifting our biodiversity in the wrong direction? We saw just yesterday the ACF had a really interesting report on banks investing in really damaging biodiversity practices. So even if you don't want to be bothered shifting your money, ring your superannuation company up. What are you doing for biodiversity? How is it shaping the kind of investment choices you're making? There are a lot of really ethical investment firms now that are actually doing extremely well in terms of their returns to customers, as well as the sort of the positive impact on the world. So it's definitely worth taking a look at how you're investing your money. And then there's obviously how we, donate our spare money, if any of us have got any, with all this kind of terrible inflation and interest rates and the like. But, definitely there are some organisations that are extremely, doing amazing things that are worth investing in. And then how you vote and advocate. It's a huge part of our lives that we don't probably realise we have so much power. Writing to how many of your listeners have written recently to their local, state or federal members? And it's easy. You can email these days. You don't even have to pick up a pen and paper. You can just write a short note and they have to get back to you. And the more people they hear from on a particular issue, the more they realise that their constituents care about it. And it actually does make a difference. It's a power that we don't flex our muscles enough as individuals, I think, in that realm.
We're good at complaining, but actually doing something about it is the next step. You know, a lot of the points you've raised every point you've raised should be nothing new to our listeners. As even as far as ethical investing, that's our current live podcast right now that we spoke about. We had a founder of a New Zealand-based superannuation, ethical investing. We've covered all this. It's nothing new, but I think what we perhaps didn't angle it too much on is the biodiversity angle. We've angled on everything else: environmental, health, all sorts of other things, but without realizing, we're also ticking the box of safeguarding and nurturing and so on, and preserving our biodiversity. So it's these individual actions are hugely impactful, and it's not just about addressing one concern. It's actually addressing 3 or 4 at the same time. Being selective with what you consume is everything from personal health to planetary health. Everything. What we consume in terms of food or purchasing stuff, it's hugely important. So it really makes us realize that we are making a difference, and that's important. Sarah, it's been an absolute pleasure. It really has been such a phenomenal conversation. You've mentioned so many times we could have a podcast on this. We could have a podcast. We're getting you back on. There's so much more we could talk about.
I'd love to. Love to.
And that we need to talk about. But thank you for really being so engaging in terms of really shedding light on the state of our urban place, where we live, where we work, where we spend the vast majority of our lives in the urban setting. There's so much we can do. There's so much we can, make better choices on to improve not just ours, but our community immediately around us. So thank you so much for sharing your passion and knowledge in this space, so to speak.
It's a pleasure. We'll keep up the good work, you guys. I love your podcast. So brilliant. Lovely to be part of it.
Thank you for listening to the Lentil Intervention Podcast. If you found this interesting, make sure you subscribe and share it with your friends.